My husband snatched the plate from my hand and pushed me at Christmas dinner. "Have you lost your mind? You don't eat until you serve my family. Eat alone." I fell to the ground in front of his whole family. But what he didn't know is that very night I would make a call that would turn his life into a nightmare. When he woke up the next morning and saw who was in the living room, his face went pale as a ghost. I still remember the exact sound my body made when it hit the cold marble floor. It wasn't a crash or a thud. It was something softer, more pathetic, like a sack of flour being dropped by careless hands. The marble was Italian, imported at great expense by my mother-in-law, Patricia, who never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was walking on floors that cost more than my parents' entire house. That Christmas Eve, as I lay sprawled on those precious tiles, I finally understood what she had been telling me all along. I was worth less than the ground beneath her feet. The chandelier above me sparkled with 1,000 tiny lights, each one reflecting in the tears I refused to let fall. I had learned long ago not to cry in front of the Montgomery family. Tears were weakness, and weakness was an invitation for more cruelty. So I blinked rapidly, forcing the moisture back, and focused on the dancing reflections above me, while my husband's shadow loomed like a thundercloud. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon, scents that should have meant warmth and family and love. In a normal home, those smells would have signaled joy, togetherness, the kind of holiday magic you see in movies and commercials. But in the Montgomery mansion, they only meant another performance. Another night of pretending I was less than human while serving a family that despised my very existence. My name is Evelyn, and for 10 years, I had been the invisible woman in the Montgomery household, the one who cooked but didn't eat at the table, the one who cleaned but was told her hands were too dirty to touch the fine china, the one who bore 2 beautiful children but was reminded daily that she had contributed nothing of value to the family name. I was a ghost in my own home, visible only when there was work to be done or criticism to be delivered. Thank you for being here. This story isn't easy to tell, but knowing you're listening makes it easier. Stay with me until the end, and if you want, let me know where you're from in the comments. I'm curious how far these words will travel. Marcus stood over me, his shadow blocking the light from the chandelier, turning the sparkling crystals above into a dark void. His hand was still raised, frozen in the aftermath of the push, as if he was considering whether to strike me again. That hand had worn a wedding ring for 10 years, the same hand that had once held mine across a candlelit table on our first date, the same hand that had trembled with emotion as he slipped a diamond onto my finger and promised to love and cherish me until death did us part. Now it was a weapon, and I was his favorite target. I remembered the first time he hit me. It was 6 months after our wedding, a beautiful June evening when I had burned the roast beef I was preparing for his parents' visit. He had apologized afterward, cried even, told me he didn't know what came over him, promised it would never happen again. And I had believed him, because I was young and in love and desperate to make my marriage work. I had been raised to believe that marriage was forever, that you worked through problems, that you didn't give up when things got hard. I didn't understand then that what I was experiencing wasn't a problem to be worked through. It was abuse, plain and simple. It would take me another 9.5 years to fully accept that truth. "Get up!" Marcus hissed through clenched teeth, his voice low enough that only I could hear the venom in it. "You're embarrassing me." I was embarrassing him. The irony of that statement would have been laughable if my elbow wasn't throbbing where it had struck the marble. I had spent 3 days preparing this dinner, 3 days of shopping and chopping and marinating and baking. I had been up since 4 a.m, stuffing the 20-pound turkey with a homemade sage and sausage stuffing that Patricia had once grudgingly admitted was acceptable. I had baked 3 different pies from scratch: apple, pumpkin, and Patricia's favorite pecan. I had set the table with the Montgomery family heirloom silverware, each piece polished to a mirror shine, arranged with military precision exactly as my mother-in-law insisted. My feet ached from standing on them for 16 hours straight. My back screamed from the constant bending and lifting. My hands were raw from scrubbing and chopping and stirring, the skin cracked and red from hot water and harsh soap. I had done everything perfectly, anticipated every need, met every demand. And when I finally sat down to eat a single bite of the meal I had created with my own exhausted hands, I was embarrassing him. The absurdity of it all might have made me laugh, except laughing would only make things worse. "Marcus, please," I whispered, trying to push myself up from the floor. My elbow throbbed where it had struck the marble, and I could feel the blood rushing to the spot, the capillaries breaking beneath my skin. I could already feel the bruise forming. Another purple mark to add to the collection I hid beneath long sleeves and high collars. By tomorrow, it would be a deep plum color. By next week, it would fade to yellow and green. By New Year's, it would be gone completely, replaced no doubt by fresh ones. This was the rhythm of my life. Bruise, heal, bruise again. An endless cycle of violence and recovery that had become as normal to me as breathing. His mother, Patricia, sat at the head of the table like a queen surveying her kingdom. She was 72 years old, but you would never know it from looking at her. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, not a strand out of place. Her makeup was flawless, applied with the precision of a woman who had been attending society events since before I was born. Her dress was designer, of course. Patricia wouldn't be caught dead in anything off the rack, and her pearls were real, inherited from her own mother, who had inherited them from hers. She didn't move to help me. She didn't tell her son to stop. Instead, she dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, monogrammed with the Montgomery family crest, naturally, and sighed, as though I were a stain on her perfect evening. A particularly stubborn stain that refused to be bleached out no matter how hard she tried. "Really, Marcus," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false concern that fooled absolutely no one. "Must you make a scene? Just have her eat in the kitchen where she belongs. It's what we've always done, with the help." The help. That's what I was to them. Not Marcus's wife. Not the mother of their grandchildren. Not a human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams of her own. The help. A servant who had somehow tricked her way into the family through marriage, but who would never, ever truly belong. I remembered the first time Patricia had called me that. It was at my own wedding reception, moments after Marcus and I had cut the cake. I had been floating on a cloud of happiness, convinced that I was the luckiest woman in the world, when I overheard Patricia talking to one of her society friends. "She's pretty enough, I suppose," Patricia had said, her voice carrying clearly despite the music and chatter. "But she's not one of us. Never will be. Still, every family needs help, and at least this one comes with a legal obligation to stay." I had been devastated. I had cried in the bathroom of my own wedding reception, ruining my carefully applied makeup, while my new husband danced with his mother and pretended not to notice that his bride had disappeared. That should have been my first warning sign. There would be many, many more. I looked around the table at the faces of the Montgomery family, searching for a single shred of sympathy, a single hint that someone might stand up for me. But I knew even as I looked that I wouldn't find it. There was Patricia, of course, the matriarch who had despised me from the moment Marcus brought me home. She had made her disapproval clear from day one, suggesting that perhaps Marcus should reconsider his choice, pointing out all the suitable women from good families who would be much more appropriate. She had expected her son to marry someone from their world, someone with a family name that appeared in the society pages, someone with a trust fund and a pedigree, someone who knew which fork to use at a formal dinner without being told. Not a girl who had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Not the daughter of a nurse who worked double shifts at the county hospital and a factory worker who had been laid off twice before I turned 10. Not someone who had put herself through community college by waitressing at a diner, and who had never owned anything designer until Marcus bought her a dress for their first society event. Beside Patricia sat her daughter, Victoria, Marcus's younger sister. At 32, Victoria was everything I was not: polished, privileged, petty. She had never worked a day in her life, unless you counted shopping as a profession. She lived in a penthouse apartment that her parents had bought her for her 21st birthday, and spent her days lunching with friends, getting her nails done, and posting carefully curated photos to social media. Victoria had her phone out, and I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that she was filming me. She was actually recording my humiliation. The camera pointed directly at my crumpled form on the marble floor. Probably to share with her friends later, to laugh about over champagne and canapes. "Look at my pathetic sister-in-law," she would say. "Can you believe Marcus married that?" The red recording light on her phone blinked like a tiny evil eye, documenting my shame for posterity. "Getting good footage, Victoria?" I wanted to ask, but I kept my mouth shut. Speaking back only made things worse. I had learned that lesson the hard way, many times over. Marcus's father, Richard, sat at the opposite end of the table from Patricia. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with a permanent frown etched into his face, like it had been carved there by decades of disapproval. He was 75 years old and still commanded respect, or fear, depending on how you looked at it, in every room he entered. He had built the Montgomery real estate empire through intimidation and ruthlessness, crushing competitors and exploiting loopholes and doing whatever it took to come out on top. Richard didn't even look at me as I lay on the floor. To him, I wasn't worth the effort of acknowledgement. I was a non-entity, a piece of furniture that had somehow developed the ability to move and speak, but was no more worthy of attention than the chairs we sat on. He continued eating his turkey, cutting precise bites with his silver knife and fork as if nothing had happened at all. And then there were my children, my babies, my reason for living. Oliver, 10 years old, sat frozen in his chair with his eyes locked on the scene before him. He had his father's dark hair, thick and wavy, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look older than his years. But my eyes, green and expressive and unable to hide a single emotion. Right now, those eyes were wide with fear. The kind of fear no child should ever have to feel at a family dinner table. And Lily, 8 years old, with red curls that bounced when she laughed, and a gap-toothed smile that was the only thing that kept me going some days. She was wearing the green velvet dress I had made for her by hand, staying up late every night for a week to get the stitching perfect. Now that dress was crumpled as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her face pale with a terror that broke my heart into a million pieces. They sat frozen in their chairs, their plates untouched, their appetites clearly forgotten. The feast I had spent 3 days preparing might as well have been ashes for all the joy it brought them now. Oliver's eyes were locked on his father, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. I saw fear. Yes, the same fear I had seen in my own reflection for 10 years. But I also saw something else, something that terrified me far more than Marcus's raised hand ever could. I saw the beginning of acceptance. I saw a little boy starting to believe that this was normal, that this was how husbands treated wives, that this was how men behaved and women endured. I saw my son starting to absorb the lesson that violence was acceptable, that power meant cruelty, that love came with bruises. I saw him beginning to become his father. No, 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 no. I couldn't let that happen. I would rather die than let my son become Marcus. I would rather burn this whole mansion to the ground than let my daughter grow up thinking this was what love looked like. "Mommy." Lily's voice was small, trembling like a leaf in a storm. She started to get up from her chair, her little body tense to run to me, to help me, to do what none of the adults in this room had done. "Mommy, are you okay?" "Sit down," Marcus snapped at her, and the coldness in his voice made even me flinch. "Your mother is fine. She just needs to remember her place. Lily flinched as though she had been struck, and tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the carefully applied blush I had put on her earlier that evening. She had wanted to look pretty for Christmas dinner, had begged me to let her wear just a little makeup, like a real lady. Now that makeup was running, and she sat back down in her chair, her small hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Something cracked inside me. Not broke. I had been broken for years. This was different. This was the sound of something being forged, something hard and cold and determined. Like steel being tempered in fire, like a blade being born from molten metal. This was the sound of a mother's patience finally running out. I had endured so much. I had told myself so many lies. But watching my daughter cry, watching my son absorb the poisonous lesson that women were meant to be pushed down and kept there, that was the line I could not cross. Oliver did something then that I will never forget as long as I live. My 10-year-old son, my quiet, gentle boy who loved books and chess and helping me in the kitchen, who still let me tuck him in at night even though he insisted he was too old for that stuff, pushed back his chair and stood up. The screech of chair legs against marble was the loudest sound in the room. "Leave Mom alone, he said. His voice was shaking. I could see his hands trembling at his sides, see the fear in every line of his small body. He was terrified. Of course he was. He was only 10 years old, and he was standing up to a man who hit without warning and hurt without remorse. But he didn't sit back down. He stood his ground, his chin raised, his eyes locked on his father. "She worked really hard on dinner," Oliver continued, and I could hear him fighting to keep his voice steady. "She should get to eat too." The silence that followed was absolute, complete. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you wonder if the world has stopped spinning on its axis. Even Victoria stopped filming. Her phone lowered slightly, her perfectly manicured finger hovering over the screen, uncertain whether to capture this new development or wait to see what would happen next. Everyone at the table stared at Oliver as though he had just spoken in tongues, as though a child standing up to Marcus Montgomery was the most shocking thing they had ever witnessed. In a way, perhaps it was. No one stood up to Marcus, not his employees, not his business partners, certainly not his wife, and definitely not a 10-year-old boy who should have known better than to interfere in adult matters. Patricia's mouth had fallen open in a most unladylike manner. Richard had actually stopped chewing, his fork suspended halfway between his plate and his mouth. Victoria looked like someone had just told her that her favorite designer had gone bankrupt. Marcus's face went from pale to red in the span of a heartbeat. I had seen that color shift before, countless times over 10 years. It was the warning sign that always preceded an explosion. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles going white with the pressure. I knew that look. I knew what came after that look. "Oliver," I said quickly, desperately, scrambling to get to my feet before the storm broke. "Sweetheart, sit down. It's okay. Mommy is fine." But Oliver didn't sit down. Instead, he did the bravest, most foolish thing I had ever seen. He stepped toward his father, his small chest puffed out, his chin raised in defiance. At 10 years old, he barely came up to Marcus's elbow. He looked like a mouse standing up to a lion, but he stood anyway. "No," Oliver said, and this time his voice didn't shake. "It's not okay. You hurt Mommy. You're always hurting Mommy." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. For a moment, everything was frozen. The whole world held its breath. Then Marcus moved. The slap echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Marcus hit his own son. He hit Oliver across the face so hard that the boy stumbled backward, knocking into his chair and sending it clattering to the floor with a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The crack of palm against cheek was still ringing in my ears as I watched my child fall. Lily screamed, a high, keening sound that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. I screamed too, though I don't remember doing it. All I remember is the white-hot rage that flooded through me, washing away 10 years of fear and submission in a single instant. I scrambled to my feet and threw myself between Marcus and the children, my arms spread wide, my body a shield. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about consequences or retaliation or what would happen to me. I was pure instinct, pure maternal fury, pure protective fire. "Don't you touch them?" The words tore from my throat in a voice I didn't recognize. It was raw and primal, the voice of an animal protecting its young, the voice of a mother who had finally been pushed past the breaking point. "Don't you ever touch my children." Marcus grabbed my arm and squeezed. His fingers dug into my flesh with bruising force, pressing against bone, and I knew there would be more purple marks tomorrow. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my arms or step aside. I kept my eyes locked on his, and for the first time in 10 years of marriage, I didn't look away first. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe, or the beginning of uncertainty. He had never seen me like this. He had grown accustomed to my compliance, my submission, my desperate attempts to keep the peace at any cost. This version of me, the one who stood her ground and met his gaze with fire in her eyes, was new to him. "Your children?" Marcus laughed, but there was something nervous in it, something uncertain. He tried to cover his unease with bluster, the way he always did. "They're Montgomery children. They belong to this family. You're just the incubator, Evelyn. You're replaceable." "They are not." The words were meant to wound, and once they would have. Once I would have crumbled under that dismissal, retreated into myself, apologized for causing trouble. But something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted inside me when I watched Marcus hit our son. Patricia stood up from her seat, her chair scraping against the floor with an elegant precision that spoke to years of practice at dramatic entrances and exits. She walked around the table with slow, deliberate steps, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome, counting down to some terrible conclusion. When she reached us, she didn't look at me. She looked at Marcus, at Oliver on the floor behind me, at Lily still crying in her chair. Then she reached out and took Lily's arm, pulling my daughter away from me with a grip that made Lily cry out in pain. "The children will spend the night in my room," Patricia announced, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through butter. "Obviously, their mother is having some sort of episode. We can't have them exposed to this hysteria." "No." I tried to reach for Lily, but Marcus still had my arm in an iron grip. My fingers grazed the green velvet of her dress, so close and yet impossibly far. "Let go of her. Lily, baby, it's okay. Mommy is right here." "Mommy," Lily was crying, struggling against Patricia's grip with all the strength her small body possessed. "Mommy, I want to stay with you. Let me go. I want my mommy." Her cries cut through me like physical blows. I had never felt so helpless, so powerless, as I did in that moment watching my daughter being dragged away while I stood frozen in my husband's grip. "Take the boy too," Marcus ordered, his voice cold and businesslike, as if he were directing the removal of unwanted furniture. "He needs to learn what happens when he disrespects his father." Richard finally moved, rising from his chair like a mountain shifting. The floor seemed to shake under his weight as he walked over to Oliver, who was still on the floor, one hand pressed against his reddening cheek. My son looked so small next to his grandfather, so fragile, like a bird that had been knocked from its nest. Richard grabbed Oliver by the collar of his shirt, bunching the fabric in his meaty fist and lifting until Oliver had no choice but to scramble to his feet or choke. My son didn't struggle. He had seen what happened when you struggled. He had watched and learned from years of observing his mother's futile resistance. He had already internalized the lesson that fighting back only made things worse. That realization hit me harder than Marcus's push ever could. "This is how we train wives in this family," Patricia said, looking directly at me with those cold, pale eyes that I had learned to fear almost as much as Marcus's fists. They were the eyes of a snake, patient and predatory, utterly without warmth. And this is how we train children. They'll thank us someday. I watched them take my children. I watched them drag Lily and Oliver out of the dining room, their cries echoing down the hallway, growing fainter with each passing second until they were swallowed up by the vastness of the mansion. The sound of their voices calling for me, "Mommy, Mommy," would haunt me for the rest of my life. And I stood there, Marcus's fingers still digging into my arm, and I felt something I had never felt before. I felt clarity. It was like a veil had been lifted from my eyes, like I was seeing the world clearly for the first time in a decade. For 10 years, I had endured. For 10 years, I had told myself it wasn't that bad, that every marriage had problems, that at least my children had a roof over their heads and food on the table. I had minimized and rationalized and excused because that's what women like me did. We survived. We adapted. We told ourselves that tomorrow would be better, that if we just tried harder, loved more, gave more, things would improve. But Marcus had hit Oliver. He had hit my son, our son, in the face, hard, enough to send him sprawling. And Patricia had taken my children away from me, as though they were objects, possessions to be moved around at will, as though I had no right to them, as though my years of sacrifice and love and devotion meant nothing at all. Tomorrow wasn't going to be better. Tomorrow was going to be worse, and the day after that would be worse still. This was my life, and this was my children's life, and if I didn't do something now, this would be their children's lives too. The cycle would continue. The abuse would pass down like a family heirloom, like the silver, like the name, like the cold cruelty that the Montgomerys seemed to cultivate as carefully as their prize roses, unless I stopped it. Marcus finally released my arm and shoved me toward the kitchen with enough force that I stumbled but didn't fall. "Clean up this mess," he said, gesturing at the table still laden with food no one had finished eating. The turkey sat in the center, carved and cooling. The mashed potatoes had formed a skin. The gravy had started to congeal. "And think about what you've done. Maybe by morning you'll have remembered your place." I walked toward the kitchen. My legs were steady, my hands were still. Something had shifted inside me, and I realized with a start that the fear was gone. The fear that had controlled me for 10 years, the fear that had made me small and silent and compliant, it was simply gone. In its place was something else, something cold and patient and calculating, something that felt remarkably like power. I walked into the kitchen and closed the door behind me. The room was a mess, pots and pans everywhere, the remnants of 3 days of cooking scattered across every surface. But I barely saw it. I leaned against the counter and took a deep breath, then another. My arm throbbed where Marcus had grabbed me. My elbow ached from hitting the floor. Somewhere in the house, I could hear Lily crying, and the sound was like broken glass in my chest. I pulled my phone from my pocket. For months, I had been building toward this moment without even knowing it. For months, I had been collecting evidence, documenting bruises with timestamped photographs, saving threatening texts in a folder hidden in my email, recording arguments on my phone when Marcus didn't know I was listening. I had told myself it was just in case. I had told myself I might never need it. But deep down, some part of me had known this day would come. Some part of me had been preparing for war. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had added just 6 months ago. A name Marcus didn't know existed. A name that would change his everything. Henry Harrison. My hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from anticipation, from the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that I was about to blow up my entire life and build something new from the ashes. I thought back to the conversation that had started all of this. It had happened just last week, a quiet afternoon when Lily was helping me fold laundry. She had been chattering away the way she always did, a constant stream of observations and questions and random thoughts that I found endlessly endearing. "Mom," she had said, so casual, so innocent, pulling a sock from the basket, "did you know Daddy's daddy isn't really dead?" I had frozen with a shirt half folded in my hands. My heart had stopped beating for a moment, then restarted at double speed. What do you mean, sweetheart? I found letters in Grandma Patricia's desk. When I was looking for paper to draw on, Lily had shrugged, completely unaware of the bomb she was dropping. There's a grandpa who writes to us. His name is Henry. He sends birthday cards and everything, but Grandma hides them. I had set down the laundry very carefully, my mind racing at 1,000 miles an hour. You found letters? From Daddy's daddy? Uh-huh, lots of them. He has really nice handwriting. He says he misses us, and he hopes we're okay, and he wants to meet us someday. Lily had looked up at me with those innocent eyes. Why does Grandma hide his letters, Mommy? Why doesn't she want us to know about Grandpa Henry? I hadn't had an answer for her then, but I had found one. That very night, after everyone was asleep, I had crept down to Patricia's study. My heart had been pounding so hard, I was sure the whole house could hear it. The desk drawer wasn't even locked. Patricia was so confident in her power over this household that she hadn't bothered with such precautions. And there, in a folder labeled simply H, I had found them. Dozens of letters, spanning years. Birthday cards for Oliver and Lily. Letters addressed to me, begging me to reach out, offering help if we ever needed it. And letters to Marcus, increasingly desperate, asking why his son refused to respond. Why the grandchildren he had never met were being kept from him. Henry Harrison. I had looked him up that very night, my phone screen glowing in the darkness of the bathroom where I had locked myself to search in private. Henry Harrison, retired federal judge. Henry Harrison, widower, philanthropist, respected member of the legal community. Henry Harrison, who had disowned his son Marcus 20 years ago, and apparently had been trying to make amends ever since, only to have every attempt intercepted by Patricia. The story I pieced together from those letters and from careful internet research painted a picture very different from the one Marcus had always told. He had claimed his father was dead, killed in a car accident when Marcus was in college. He had described a difficult man, cold and demanding, but ultimately a tragedy. I had accepted that story, had even felt sympathy for my husband's loss. It was all lies. The truth was far more disturbing. Henry Harrison had disowned his son after Marcus nearly killed a girlfriend in college. He had beaten her so badly, she was hospitalized for 2 weeks. Henry, then a sitting judge with connections and influence, had given Marcus a choice: undergo intensive therapy and make genuine, demonstrated change, or face complete estrangement from the family. Marcus had chosen estrangement. He had chosen his anger over his father's love. And then he had told everyone that his father was dead, rewriting history to cast himself as the victim of fate rather than the architect of his own isolation. I had reached out to Henry. It had taken weeks of careful, secret communication, emails from a new account Marcus didn't know about, calls made from the library while he thought I was grocery shopping, furtive text messages deleted immediately after reading. And I had learned the truth about the man I had married, the family I had married into, and the trap I had been caught in for 10 years. Henry Harrison was horrified by what I told him about his grandchildren's lives. He had suspected something was wrong. Why else would his letters go unanswered? Why else would he be denied access to Oliver and Lily? But he hadn't known the full extent of it. When I told him about the abuse, about the control, about the terror that defined our daily existence, his voice had broken over the phone. I failed him, Henry had said, and I could hear tears in his voice. I failed my son. I thought cutting him off would force him to change, but all it did was give him free rein to become worse. And now he's hurting you. He's hurting those children. I don't know what to do, I had admitted. I have no money of my own. I have no family who can help. If I try to leave, he'll destroy me. He'll take the children. He has lawyers and resources, and I have nothing. You have me, Henry had said. I know it's not enough to make up for 20 years of absence. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I have resources too. I have connections. And I have spent the last 2 decades regretting that I let my son slip away into darkness without fighting harder to save him. Let me fight for you instead. Let me fight for those children. We had made a plan. Henry had been preparing, waiting for my signal, ready to help me the moment I was ready to help myself. He had connected me with lawyers who specialized in domestic abuse cases. He had set up a trust fund for the children that Marcus and Patricia knew nothing about. He had even found a safe place for us to stay when the time came. All he needed was my go-ahead. Tonight, I was ready. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, he answered. "Evelyn?" His voice was warm, worried. "Is everything all right? I wasn't expecting to hear from you on Christmas Eve." "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "It's not all right. He hit Oliver. He hit our son." There was silence on the other end of the line. I heard a sharp intake of breath, then a long, heavy exhale that seemed to contain a lifetime of regret and grief. "I'll be there first. Thing in the morning," Henry said. His voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but now it was layered with steel. 6:30. Have the children ready if you can. If not, it doesn't matter. I'll have a CPS worker with me and a police escort. It's time to end this, Evelyn. It's past time. Thank you. My voice cracked on the words. Tears were streaming down my face now, but they felt different from all the tears I had shed before. These weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release. "Thank you, Henry." "No," he said softly. "Thank you for being brave enough to make this call, for giving me the chance to meet my grandchildren, for stopping the cycle that I failed to stop 20 years ago." I hung up and stood there in the kitchen, my phone clutched against my chest. Outside, through the window above the sink, I could see snow beginning to fall. Fat white flakes drifting down from a sky that had gone black and quiet, covering the world in a blanket of clean, fresh white. It was going to be a white Christmas. Tomorrow, everything would be covered in snow. Tomorrow, everything would be new. But first, I had to get through tonight. I took another deep breath and began cleaning up the kitchen, scraping plates and loading the dishwasher, as though nothing had changed, as though I was still the same beaten-down woman who had walked in here 10 minutes ago. I washed the pots and pans. I wiped down the counters. I wrapped the leftover turkey in foil and put it in the refrigerator. I moved through the motions of domesticity that had defined my existence for 10 years. But inside, I was anything but domestic. Inside, I was a warrior preparing for battle. Around midnight, the house finally went quiet. Marcus had gone to bed hours ago, dismissing me with a wave of his hand and an order to sleep on the couch. He didn't want me in his bedroom tonight, he said. I disgusted him. I was an embarrassment. I should think about what I had done and pray he was in a forgiving mood by morning. I had nodded and said nothing, which was what he expected. What he didn't expect was the smile that tugged at the corners of my mouth after he turned away. By morning, forgiveness would be the least of his concerns. Patricia had taken the children to her suite on the 3rd floor, and I could only pray they were asleep, that they had found some peace in dreams. Tomorrow, I would hold them in my arms and tell them that everything was going to be okay. Tomorrow, I would keep that promise. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch in the dark living room, watching the snow fall through the tall windows, counting the hours until morning. The Christmas tree glowed softly in the corner, its lights reflecting off the ornaments that Patricia had insisted on choosing herself. Real crystal, hand-blown glass, nothing cheap or sentimental. Even the tree was a monument to the Montgomery aesthetic. Perfect, cold, beautiful, and completely devoid of joy. My arm ached where Marcus had grabbed me. My elbow throbbed from hitting the floor. Tomorrow, I would have bruises. Today, I had hope. At 5 a.m, I got up and went to the kitchen. I made coffee, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. The familiar ritual of grinding beans and measuring water helped keep my nerves at bay. I watched the sun begin to rise through the kitchen window, painting the snow-covered lawn in shades of pink and gold. It was Christmas morning. It was the most beautiful Christmas morning I had ever seen. At 6:15, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Then another, and another. I walked to the front window and looked out, and my breath caught in my throat. There were 3 cars. The first was a black sedan, polished to a gleam despite the early hour and the falling snow. From it emerged Henry Harrison, and I recognized him immediately from the photos I had found online. He was a tall man in his 70s, with Marcus's dark hair gone silver and Marcus's jaw softened by age. But where Marcus's face was hard and cruel, Henry's was kind, lined with the sort of wrinkles that come from smiling rather than scowling. He was wearing a suit despite the early hour, perfectly pressed, and his face was set in an expression of grim determination. The second car was a police cruiser, its lights off but unmistakable. 2 officers got out, a man and a woman, their boots crunching in the fresh snow as they walked toward the house. They moved with the careful alertness of professionals who had done this before, who knew what they might be walking into. The third car was white, unmarked, and from it emerged a woman in a business suit carrying a clipboard. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with a serious expression and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. CPS, just as Henry had promised. I walked to the front door and opened it before they could knock. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I barely felt it. All I felt was hope, rising in my chest like a bird taking flight. Henry's eyes met mine, and I saw tears glistening in them. He looked at me, at the bruises already forming on my arm, at the exhaustion carved into my face, at the desperate hope in my eyes, and I saw his heart break. "Evelyn," he said softly, "it's so good to finally meet you in person." "They're upstairs," I said, my voice stronger than I had expected. "The children. Patricia took them. 3rd floor, the east wing. And there's a bruise on Oliver's face, where Marcus hit him. It's shaped like a hand. You can see the finger marks." Henry's jaw tightened. He looked at the CPS worker, then at the police officers. "Let's go," he said. I led them into the house, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. This was it. There was no going back now. In a few minutes, Marcus would wake up and come downstairs, and he would see his dead father standing in the living room, and nothing would ever be the same. The police officers stayed by the door, their hands resting casually on their utility belts in a way that was clearly intentional. The CPS worker began taking notes, her pen scratching against paper in the early morning quiet. Henry and I walked into the living room and stood there, waiting. The Christmas tree cast colored shadows on the walls. The snow continued to fall outside. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds until everything changed. We didn't have to wait long. I heard footsteps on the stairs first, heavy and unhurried. Marcus always walked like he owned the world, like every room he entered was his kingdom, and every person in it his subject. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, turned toward the living room, and stopped. "What the hell?" I will never forget the look on my husband's face when he saw his father. It was like watching a ghost materialize before his eyes. All the color drained from Marcus's cheeks, leaving him gray and waxy. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His hands, those hands that had hurt me so many times, trembled at his sides. He was wearing his robe, the expensive silk one that he never let anyone else touch. His hair was mussed from sleep. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, standing there in the doorway of his own living room, confronted by the father he had told everyone was dead. "Hello, Marcus," Henry said. His voice was calm, controlled, but I could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface, like magma waiting to erupt. "It's been a long time. You're dead." Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "You're supposed to be dead." Funny how lies work, isn't it? Henry took a step forward, and Marcus actually flinched. The great Marcus Montgomery, who had terrorized me for a decade, flinched away from his elderly father like a child caught stealing cookies. You tell them long enough, you start to believe them yourself. But I'm not dead, son. I'm very much alive. And I'm here to meet my grandchildren and to make sure they never have to live with your abuse again. Marcus's eyes darted around the room, taking in the police officers by the door, the CPS worker with her clipboard, me standing beside his father. Understanding dawned on his face, followed quickly by rage. You, he snarled, pointing at me with a trembling finger. You did this. You ungrateful, conniving. Don't. Henry's voice cracked like a whip. Don't say another word to her. You've said enough. You've done enough. This ends now. This is my house. Marcus stepped forward, his hands clenching into fists. These are my children. You have no right. Actually, the CPS worker spoke up, her voice professional and steady. Based on the evidence provided to our office, including photographs of injuries to both Mrs. Montgomery and the minor child Oliver Montgomery, we have every right to conduct a welfare check. And based on what I'm seeing, she gestured at my arm where the bruises from last night had bloomed into vivid purple and blue. I'm inclined to pursue emergency custody arrangements. Marcus lunged. I don't know what he was trying to do. Grab me, maybe, or attack his father, or simply explode in the violent way he always did when he felt cornered. But the police officers were faster. They intercepted him before he could reach any of us, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back with practiced efficiency. Marcus Montgomery, one of the officers said, you're under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You can't do this. Marcus struggled against the officers, his face contorted with rage. This is my house. She's my wife. Those are my children. Not anymore, Henry said quietly. None of this is yours anymore. Upstairs, I heard a door open, footsteps on the landing, and then Patricia's voice, shrill with outrage. What is going on down there? Marcus? Who are those people? She appeared at the top of the stairs, her silk robe wrapped around her like armor, her silver hair perfect despite the early hour. Even in crisis, Patricia Montgomery looked camera-ready. Behind her, clutching each other's hands, were Oliver and Lily. Mommy! Lily broke free from Patricia's grip and ran down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the marble, her nightgown streaming behind her like a white flag. She threw herself into my arms, and I caught her and held her tight, burying my face in her tangled curls, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and her sleep-warm skin. It's okay, baby, I whispered. It's okay. Mommy's here. Mommy's not going anywhere. Oliver came down the stairs more slowly, his eyes locked on the scene in the living room. He saw his father in handcuffs, struggling against the police officers. He saw his grandmother frozen at the top of the stairs. He saw me, standing with Lily in my arms, finally free. He walked over to me and wrapped his arms around my waist, pressing his face against my side. I felt his shoulders shaking, and I realized he was crying. Crying with relief, maybe. Or just crying because sometimes that's all you can do when the nightmare finally ends. Who is that man? Oliver asked, his voice muffled against my sweater. The one who looks like Dad but older? I looked at Henry Harrison, and he looked back at me with tears streaming down his face. That's your grandfather, I said. Your real grandfather, and he's here to help us. Patricia came down the stairs, her face a mask of fury. Henry, how dare you show up here after all these years? This is none of your business. This is a family matter. They are my family, Henry interrupted. Those children are my grandchildren, and you have spent years hiding them from me, intercepting my letters, making them believe I didn't exist. That ends. Today, Patricia. Everything ends today. You can't just... Yes, I can. Henry's voice was firm, but not unkind. I'm a retired federal judge, Patricia. I still have connections, and I have spent the last 6 months gathering evidence of what goes on in this house. The abuse, the control, the terror. Oliver has a handprint bruise on his face. Evelyn has bruises on her arm that look like fingerprints. And I have documentation going back years. So yes, I can, and I will. Marcus was still struggling against the police officers, still shouting threats and obscenities, but they were leading him toward the door now. He looked back at me one last time, and I saw something I had never seen in his eyes before. Fear. He was afraid. For the first time in our entire marriage, Marcus Montgomery was afraid. And I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "This isn't over," he screamed as the officers pushed him through the front door. "I'll destroy you, Evelyn. I'll take everything. You'll never see those children again." The door closed behind him, cutting off his threats mid-sentence. And suddenly, the house was quiet. The following weeks were a blur of courtrooms and paperwork and small victories that added up to something resembling freedom. The emergency custody hearing happened the day after Christmas, and the judge, a colleague of Henry's who had no patience for domestic abusers, granted me full temporary custody of Oliver and Lily. Marcus's visitation was denied pending investigation. Patricia's involvement was noted and flagged for further review. We moved into the cottage on Henry's property that same day. It was small, just 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room, but it was warm and bright, with windows that let in the winter sunlight and a fireplace that crackled cheerfully in the corner. There was a Christmas tree, already decorated with presents underneath. "I took the liberty," Henry said, looking almost shy. "I didn't know what they would like, but I wanted them to have a proper Christmas." The trial came 3 months later, in the early spring when the snow was melting and the first crocuses were pushing through the mud. Marcus was charged with multiple counts of assault, child abuse, and domestic battery. His lawyer negotiated aggressively, trying to get the charges reduced, but the evidence was overwhelming. I testified for 3 days. I told the jury about the first time Marcus hit me, just 6 months after our wedding, when I burned dinner and he slapped me so hard I saw stars. I told them about the escalation over the years, how the slaps became punches, how the punches became kicks, how I learned to walk without limping and to cover bruises with makeup and to lie to doctors about how I got hurt. I told them about Christmas Eve, about the plate, the fall, the slap that split Oliver's lip. I showed them photographs and played recordings and let them see the receipts from hospitals and pharmacies. The paper trail of a decade of abuse. The turning point came when Oliver asked to speak. He was 10 years old, small for his age, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of nightmares that hadn't stopped. But he walked to the front of the courtroom with his shoulders squared and his chin raised. "My dad hit me," Oliver said, his voice clear and steady. "On Christmas Eve, in front of everyone. And that wasn't the first time. He's been hitting my mom for as long as I can remember. I used to hear her crying at night after he was done with her. I used to see the bruises she tried to hide. And I was scared all the time. I was scared of my own father." The courtroom was silent. Marcus's lawyer looked stricken. "I don't want to see my dad," Oliver continued. "I don't want him to come to our new house. I don't want him near my sister. She has nightmares now, you know. She wakes up screaming for mommy because she's scared daddy is going to come back and hurt her." He paused, and I saw him swallow hard. This was so much for a 10-year-old to bear. "I know you're the judge, and you have to decide what's fair. But I'm asking you, please don't make me see my dad. Please let us be safe. That's all I want. I just want my mom and my sister to be safe." The verdict came back guilty on all counts. Marcus was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 4. The restraining order became permanent. He would never come within 500 feet of me or the children again. When the judge announced the sentence, I turned around and saw Patricia Montgomery standing at the back of the courtroom, her face gray, her eyes hollow. She had aged 10 years and 3 months. She looked like a woman whose entire world had collapsed around her. I felt nothing for her. She had chosen to enable her son's violence, and now she was living with the consequences. That was her burden to carry, not mine. After the trial, I signed the divorce papers that my lawyer had prepared. I got the cottage. Henry had legally transferred it to me. I got full custody of the children. I got a settlement that would ensure I never had to worry about money again, and I got my future back. And the first year after the trial was the hardest. The children and I went through therapy, separately and together, learning how to process the trauma we had experienced. Oliver had anger issues for a while. He would lash out at school, get into fights with other kids. It took months of patient work with a child psychologist to help him understand that his anger wasn't the problem, it was what he did with it that mattered. Lily had nightmares. She would wake up screaming, convinced that Marcus was standing at the foot of her bed. I would hold her until she stopped shaking, and I would promise her that she was safe. Slowly, the nightmares faded. They never went away completely, but they became less frequent. A year after the trial, I enrolled in law school. It was something I had always wanted to do back before I met Marcus, before my dreams got swallowed up by survival. Henry offered to pay my tuition, but I refused. I had the settlement money. I could pay my own way. I graduated 3 years later, magna cum laude. Oliver and Lily sat in the front row of the auditorium, cheering so loud that the dean had to ask them to quiet down. Henry sat beside them, crying openly. I walked across the stage and took my diploma, and I thought about everything it had taken to get there. The abuse, the fear, the Christmas Eve phone call, the trial, the healing, the long, slow work of rebuilding a life from the ashes. It was worth it. All of it was worth it. After graduation, I took a job at a nonprofit that specialized in domestic violence cases. I became the lawyer I wished I'd had, someone who understood what it meant to be trapped in an abusive relationship, someone who didn't judge, someone who knew that leaving was never as simple as it seemed from the outside. I helped women like me, women who were afraid, who had been gaslit into doubting their own reality, who thought they had no options. I showed them the path I had walked, and I held their hands while they took the first steps. 5 years after that Christmas Eve, I was sitting on the porch of my cottage, watching the sunset over the fields. Oliver was 17 now, tall and serious and planning to study psychology in college. Lily was 15, with her father's dark eyes but my mother's kind heart. Henry was 80 now, moving slower but still sharp as ever. And me, I was happy. Not perfectly happy. No one is perfectly happy, but truly, deeply content. I had a career I loved. I had children who made me proud every single day. I had a home, a community, a purpose. "Penny for your thoughts," Henry said, handing me a mug of hot chocolate. "I was thinking about Christmas Eve," I said, "the one 5 years ago, when I made the call that changed everything." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't called?" I asked. Henry was quiet for a long time. "I try not to. But sometimes I thank God, or fate, that you did." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "I almost put the phone down. I almost told myself it wasn't that bad." "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." "Why not?" I thought about it. Because he hit Oliver. Because for the first time, it wasn't about me. It was about my children. And I realized that if I didn't do something, they would grow up thinking this was normal. Oliver would become Marcus. Lily would become me. The cycle would continue. Henry nodded slowly. A mother's love. There's nothing more powerful in the world. The years continued to pass, each one better than the last. Oliver graduated from high school as valedictorian. He went to Stanford on a full scholarship. Lily graduated 2 years later with art school scholarships from 3 different universities. Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep when he was 84, surrounded by the family he had helped create. I held his hand in those final hours, and I told him that he had saved us. He smiled at me with those kind eyes and said, "You saved yourself, Evelyn. I just opened the door. You're the one who walked through it." Marcus was released from prison after 5 years on good behavior. I heard about it through my lawyer. I didn't feel afraid when I heard the news. I felt nothing at all. He had no power over me anymore. He was just a man who had made terrible choices and faced the consequences. Last I heard, he was living in a 1-bedroom apartment somewhere in Nevada, working at a car wash. The same man who had once told me I was worthless was now washing other people's cars for minimum wage. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard this. I didn't feel vindication. I felt nothing at all. He was irrelevant. He always had been. Oliver got his PhD in clinical psychology when he was 28. He specialized in treating children from abusive homes. He opened a practice in our hometown, working with kids who reminded him of himself, scared, angry, convinced that no one could help them. He showed them that there was another way. Lily became a successful artist. Her paintings displayed in galleries across the country. Her work often featured women, strong women, fierce women, women rising from ashes with fire in their eyes. Critics called her style redemption art, and she didn't correct them. And me? I continued to work at the nonprofit until I was 62. I helped hundreds of women escape abusive relationships. I trained a new generation of lawyers who understood what it meant to fight for the vulnerable. I gave speeches at conferences and testified before Congress about the need for stronger domestic violence protections. Then I retired. I moved into a small house by the ocean, a place I had always dreamed about. I spent my days reading and gardening and watching the waves crash against the shore. Oliver and Lily visited often, sometimes with their own families. On my 70th birthday, my grandchildren asked me to tell them a story. They wanted to know everything, so I told them. I told them about the Christmas Eve when their grandfather pushed me to the floor. I told them about the phone call and the police and the trial. I told them about their great-great-grandfather Henry, the man who had opened his door and his heart to strangers because it was the right thing to do. "Were you scared?" my youngest granddaughter asked. "Terrified, I admitted. Every single day. But I did it anyway. That's what courage is. Not being unafraid, but being afraid and doing the right thing anyway." Later that night, I sat on my porch and watched the sun set over the ocean. I thought about everything I had survived. The abuse, the fear, the years of being told I was worthless. And then I thought about everything I had become. A mother, a lawyer, an advocate, a survivor. I had taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and turned it into a purpose. I had transformed my pain into power, my trauma into testimony. I had helped hundreds of women and children escape the same darkness I had once been trapped in. And I had raised two incredible human beings who were out there in the world, making it better every single day. Not bad for a woman who had once been told she was nothing. I picked up my pen and wrote the final line of my memoir. This is my story, but it doesn't have to be yours. There is always a way out. There is always hope. You just have to be brave enough to reach for it. I put down the pen and looked at the words on the page. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly at peace. Because I had done it. I had survived. I had thrived. And I had proven, once and for all, that no one, not Marcus, not Patricia, not anyone, could ever take my power away from me again. I was Evelyn. I was a mother, a grandmother, a lawyer, a writer. I was free, and that was everything.